tonight we're here to talk about, well, Dr. Boster is going to speak for about 20 minutes about clinical trials. He's going to speak about some treatments that are on the horizon, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A, all right? So this, for people that can't read, sorry, Dr. Boster, but for those that can't read, this is an MS Views Now program created and sent to you and put on to you by MS Views and News. And like I said, I'm Stuart Schlossman, and this is Dr. Aaron Boster. And this program tonight is supported by Sandoz and Sanofi. Great, now it's your turn.
Howdy, my name's Aaron Boster. As always, thank you for learning about MS with me. I want to thank MS Views and News for being a consistent and constant source of energy and empowerment and education for families impacted by MS. I love interacting with you guys, and so as always, thank you for having me back. Today, I'm looking forward to spending 15-20 minutes doing a bit of a didactic and talking to you about something which is very near and dear to my heart, and that's MS clinical trials. And so I like to spend a few minutes helping you understand what an MS clinical trial is, how it's structured, how we do them, why we do them. Then I'm going to give some examples of some trials that we're involved in at the Boster Center for MS. Then we're going to open the lines up, and as Stuart and I are fond of doing, we'll take your questions for a good bit of time. So I decided to go into MS when I was a kid because my uncle Mark had MS, and I watched him in an era when there weren't therapies deteriorate. And I watched my grandparents who cared for him in their home struggle. And I told my family that I was going to learn to do it better than the men that were taking care of my uncle at that time. And transparently, I didn't know what I was telling my family. I didn't know that I was going to go to school till I was 35. I didn't know that I'd be bald by the time I was done with my training. I just knew that nobody should feel that scared and alone, and particularly not my family. And I was very mission driven when I went into my undergraduate education. I sought out doing neuroscience because I knew I wanted to do MS neurology. When I started med school, I declared, hey, I'm going to do neurology. I want to do MS. And when I applied for neurology residency, so after medical school, you start a neurology residency. I remember very vividly, I was doing an interview for residency where you go to the location and you interview with all of the faculty to see if they want to take you on as a resident. And I was actually at Case Western Reserve up in Cleveland, Ohio. I was doing an interview there. I was wearing my only suit that I owned. I was very nervous. I had my notebook with my pen and all of my notes ready. And the guy that was interviewing me, the neurologist, I don't remember his name. I do remember when we got in his office, he took his shoes off and he put his feet up on his desk. And he said, so what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, sir, I want to be an MS neurologist. And he said, you want to go into academics. And I kind of looked at him, he goes, you know the difference between academics and private practice? And I said, actually, no, I don't. He said, well, let me make it really easy for you. If you go into private practice, he told me, all you're going to do is peddle what's currently available, which in your field at that time isn't very good. But he told me if you go into research, then you're going to be able to help develop the next wave of therapies to help treat people with MS better. And that solidified it for me. I said, okay, well, then I'm going to do academics. Moving along in my career, I finished my neurology residency. I did a fellowship. And during my fellowship, I spent 2 years learning how to do MS clinical trials. And then I started my first big boy job in academics. I worked at a big university in Columbus, Ohio. And I went to that university because I thought that I had to be in an academic environment in order to do clinical trials. Now, I'm older and wiser, and as it turns out, you don't need to be in academics to do clinical trials, but you do have to have the right pieces and parts because clinical trials are very, very complex. And I want to spend some time explaining that to you. Before I do that, I want to take pause and I want to say thank you to tens of thousands of people impacted by MS who have come before us, who have volunteered their bodies to help us find solutions to problems, to help us find therapies, to help us find diagnostic tools. If you think about it, anybody who's listening right now who either is impacted by MS themselves or knows somebody impacted by MS, if that person, or if you're on a medicine to treat MS, the reason that medicine exists is because someone with MS before you volunteered to participate in a clinical trial to help clarify if that medicine works. Otherwise put, if you didn't have a single soul volunteer to do a clinical trial, there would be 0 drugs available. When I shared that story when I was in residency, there were 3 drugs available to treat MS. And in hindsight, we now understand those drugs are not awesome sauce. They're not very, very efficacious therapies. I now easily count over 28 different disease-modifying therapies to treat MS. And the reason that we've gone from 3 to 28 is because of the virtue of people that have volunteered their bodies to help us figure out if something works. And I think that's really, really special. So I want to say thank you to all of those people with MS who have volunteered to participate in clinical trials. Without you guys, we wouldn't have a single therapy to offer. Now, if you think about it, a manufacturer, a drug company, develops a molecule. So they come up with a thing they think is probably going to be awesome. They've developed a pill or a shot or an infusion or something, and it seems to them that this is probably going to be a really, really good drug to treat multiple sclerosis. But they're a drug company. They don't have patients. So they don't know if it's going to work. Typically, they develop a drug in a laboratory. They test it in mice. They may test it in non-human primates like monkeys or something like this. And they get to the point where they want to test it in humans, but they don't have access to any humans. They're not MS centers. They don't have. And so what they do is they partner with centers like mine. So at the Boster Center for MS, we partner with manufacturers who are studying molecules, who are studying drugs that they think will be the next best thing. And a given drug company may open up clinical sites in, say, 100 different sites, or maybe even more. And at each site, so like my center would be an example of one site, we would take on that clinical trial and we would enroll maybe 3 patients, maybe 10 patients into that trial. And when 100 sites do that, you build up enough numbers that you can start to ask the question, could this drug be really, really helpful to treat MS? So I'd like to talk for a few minutes about what's involved in doing that. When you do human research, we divide it into different phases. There's a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3. There's actually a phase 4. Phase 1 is typically when you give the molecule to poor college kids, healthy controls, who don't necessarily have MS. And I joke, and it's to see if they blow up. Really what you're doing in a phase 1 is you're proving that the molecule is safe to give to humans. You're learning a lot about the safety of the molecule, and you're starting to look at dose finding. What range of the medicine do we think we're going to test in the humans? Now, if you do a phase 1 trial and you determine that this medicine is safe in humans, we figure out the range of the dose we want to use, then they move on to phase 2. And so in my career, I've done a lot of phase 2 trials. A phase 2 trial is where you're now testing the molecule in the patient population of interest. So you're now testing it not in a healthy control, but in a population of people impacted by MS. But you're not doing it to prove it works per se. You're still testing safety. You're still doing what's called dose finding. So you're dialing in the dose, and you're doing what's called a proof of concept. So instead of proving, for example, that a new DMT decreases attacks and decreases disability progression, in a phase 2, you're going to show a proof of concept that you can improve the MRI outcome. Phase 2 trials are normally pretty short. Sometimes they're only like a couple months, like 6 months long. And what you'll do in a phase 2 trial, for example, is you might enroll people impacted by MS. And in the trial, they may get, let's say that it's a pill trial. So everyone is taking a medicine, and half the people are taking the study medicine. And in a phase 2 trial, half the people might be taking no medicine. Now that's called a placebo-controlled trial. And before you go, it's a very short exposure. It's only a 6-month exposure. So you're not asking someone to be at risk of placebo for a very long time. And you'll get an MRI before and you'll get an MRI right afterwards. And what you can do is you can say, okay, compared to the people that for a period of several months weren't taking something, The ones that were, their MRIs looked better. And if they're able to demonstrate this proof of concept, the fact that the drug worked well to slow down or to improve the MRI, then they'll get the green light, if you will, to do a phase 3. But let's talk a little bit longer about phase 2. When you do a phase 2 trial, at the end of that short investigation, a couple months long, very commonly, all the people who participated in the trial then go on study drug. So if you were randomly given the study drug, you stay on study drug. And if you were randomly given placebo, now you're offered study drug. But here's the kicker. It's no longer an experiment where you're blinded, where you don't know what you're on. All the people know that they're on the study drug, and they're given it for free, and it's called open label. So many patients of mine will be comfortable going into a phase 2 trial for a short period of time, for a couple months. They may be on a new exciting drug, they may be on a placebo, but then after that, they're guaranteed to be on the real deal, to be on the study drug, and they'll run what's called a long-term open label extension, where the person is now, they know what they're taking. It's no longer a secret, and they're being monitored in the clinic. They're being monitored by myself. They're getting MRIs. All of that is covered by the manufacturer, and the manufacturer who is studying the drug is learning from this population of people. Now, when you finish your phase 2, if it works, if the proof of concept works, so you show this new molecule cleans up the MRI, let's say, so people on it had better MRI outcomes, and the drug is deemed safe and they figured out the dosing, then you enter into what's called phase 3. And the majority of the clinical trials that I've participated in, and at this point in my career, gosh, I've probably done 60 plus some trials, most of them have been phase 3. A phase 3 trial is, again, where you study the molecule or the drug in patients with MS, and this time you're going to prove that it works typically better than a known drug. And the phase 3 trials are what you then use to apply to the American FDA and to the European EMA to get drug approval for it to become available to the population. And so I'll give you an example of, we'll take a trial with a study drug. And I'm going to talk specifically about specific trials here in just a few minutes. But in a phase 3, you'll be on the research drug or what's called an active comparator, which is a treatment that's already been shown to work in MS. So very popular these days, we'll compare a study drug against the pill Aubagio. So when you're doing a phase 3 trial, everyone in the trial is on an MS medicine, guaranteed. And half the people are on the study drug and half the people are on, say, the active comparator. I use the example of Aubagio, and the patient doesn't know which one they're on, and I, the investigator, don't know which one they're on. That's called a double blind. So the patient doesn't know and I don't know. We both know that they're on a real drug, we just don't know which one. That's the experiment. And whereas a phase 2 trial is typically very short, a couple months, phase 3 trials are long. They're typically 3 years in this double-blind scenario. So for 3 years, the patient is receiving study drug, not through an insurance product, but through the manufacturer. They're being given the drug for free by the manufacturer. And they're coming into clinic, not through insurance, but the manufacturer is paying for the study visits. And they're getting MRIs, which the manufacturer is paying for. And the patient is volunteering their body. They're taking the medicine, and we're studying how they do. We're looking for relapses. We do examinations to see how their neuroexam is changing. We have them fill out surveys about how their life is going and what's going on. And we do MRI scans to see if we see new spots. And at the end of the 3 years, the double blind period ends and the data gets locked down. And then behind the scenes, the manufacturer does some very complex math where basically they see, did the people that were on the study drug do better or worse than the people that were on the active comparator? So when I say better or worse, there's a couple different things they look at. Did they have more attacks or less attacks? Did they have worse progression of neurological disability on exam or less? Did they have more spots on the MRI or less spots? Did they have accelerated brain volume loss or less accelerated brain volume loss? And at the end of the phase 3 trial, if it's a positive trial, that's what they take to the American FDA and say, hey, look, we've proven that this new study drug is superior to a known drug. We would like to apply for approval. Now, just like with the phase 2 trial, at the end of the phase 3 trial, we unblind and we say, hey, you've been in the trial for 3 years, you were taking a drug, you didn't know which one it was. Turns out it was X or Y. It was the study drug, or it was the active comparator. And at that point, everybody is offered the study drug for free, open label. So now all the people that in a blinded fashion had randomly been given the study drug for those 3 years now continue on the study drug, but they now know it. It's no longer an experiment which is blinded. And all the people that were on the active comparator for 3 years, even though they didn't know it because we were blinded, they then are put on the study drug, but it's open label. And the open label extension will continue oftentimes indefinitely. Why? Because those patients have some of the longest exposure to the study drug, and they are a constant source of education and information because they've been taking it longer than all the people that are going to start it through their insurance later. And so it's been a source of pride for myself and my clinic to offer clinical trials phase 2 and phase 3. Now, phase 4 is a trial after a drug has been FDA approved. So after it's on the market and it's been FDA approved, sometimes we'll go back and we'll ask a question. Could the drug work better if we tweak it this way? Could the drug be able to demonstrate a new outcome, that it can do something special? And after the drug's been approved, they'll do what's called a phase 4. And this is just a real quick 10,000-foot overview of clinical trials in the setting of MS. Now, I would like to talk about a couple trials which are contemporary, going on right now. And these are trials that I've been actively involved in at the Boster Center for MS. One set of trials is studying a drug called BTK inhibitors, which does not stand for bind, torture, kill. BTK stands for Bruton tyrosine kinase. So the BTK inhibitor, or the Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitor, is a pill that you take which blocks some of the machinery inside the B cell. Now, we know that treating MS can be done very effectively by killing B cells. And there's a lot of B cell killers, a lot of B cell depleting medicines that are out on the market. So, for example, there's medicines like Rituxan and Ocrevus and Kesimpta and Briumvi. These are really effective medicines which treat MS by killing B cells. But there's a problem with killing B cells because then there can be an increased risk of infection. A BTK inhibitor doesn't kill the B cell. It mucks up the B cell's ability to communicate. It breaks some of the machinery inside the B cell. So the B cell's not murdered, and the B cell can be stimulated, but then it can't communicate. And so it's like a plugging in your ears, so the B cell can't be, la, 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 I can't hear you. And in doing so, by blocking B cell communication, we can have an impact on multiple sclerosis. BTK inhibitors also work on another cell, which to date we really haven't been able to reach. These are cells that are part of the immune system, and the cell is called microglia. And microglia live in the brain. They don't float around in the bloodstream like B cells. They live inside the brain, and they're part of the immune system called the innate immune system. And we've known for many, many, many years that microglia, like B cells, are involved in MS, but we haven't been able to reach them because we haven't been able to get in the brain and turn them off. BTK inhibitors not just block B cell communication, but they also turn off activated microglia. So that's very exciting. And there's been a bunch of clinical trials ongoing the last several years studying BTK inhibitors. There's been trials that have looked at treating relapsing multiple sclerosis, where we give patients either a BTK inhibitor or Aubagio, the way I was describing earlier. And so far, the trials that have looked at relapsing MS for BTK inhibitors have not been able to demonstrate that those drugs did better than Aubagio. So actually, in the clinical trials, the drug was good, but it wasn't better than the Aubagio medicine. And there's been two what we call negative trials. One was studying a BTK inhibitor called evobrutinib with relapsing MS. And there's another one called tolobrutinib with relapsing MS. And we will not see those drugs go on for relapsing MS to the FDA because they weren't better than what's currently available. However, there's a very, very exciting trial, which I got to participate in, called the Hercules trial. And in the Hercules trial, we studied a BTK inhibitor called tolobrutinib, And we looked at it not in relapsing patients, but in people with what's called non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. So these are people that have MS and they used to have attacks, but they haven't in a long time, and they're getting worse. And in this phase 3 trial, we gave people either tolebrutinib or placebo. Why? Because there's no drugs that have been proven to work in non-relapsing SPMS. And guess what? It worked. We were able to demonstrate that we could slow disability by 29% compared to being on placebo. And that's a really, really big deal because we've never been able to do that before. And the American FDA agreed that that's a really big deal. And so they have fast-tracked the FDA approval for tolebrutinib to hopefully become FDA approved to be used to treat non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. And today, the Hercules paper was published. So it's now out in the New England Journal of Medicine as of this morning, which is very, very exciting. Now, there's a couple other investigations looking at BTK inhibitors. There's another trial that I'm involved in that I'm very, very excited about. It also is using the medicine tolebrutinib. And this is a trial called the Perseus trial. And the Perseus trial is not looking at relapsing MS. It's not looking at secondary progressive MS. It's actually looking at primary progressive MS. And we have several patients at the Boster Center for MS that have participated in this trial, and it's ongoing. And because the drugs seem to work in secondary progressive MS, we're very, very hopeful that it's going to work in primary progressive MS. So stay tuned as we learn more about that. Now, I'll wrap up by sharing with you yet another set of clinical trials that I'm very excited to be involved in. And this is trials for an infused medicine, a medicine which is infused in the vein, and it's given once every month. And this is another drug which messes with B cells in a different way. And this is called an anti-CD40 ligand. I didn't make up these terms, by the way. And the anti-CD40 ligand drug, which is being tested, is called frexilizumab. Again, these are like weird Scrabble words. And so we just call it Frex in my office because frexilizumab is hard to say. In the Frex trial, we're studying this in secondary progressive MS and a different trial in relapsing MS. All the patients are receiving an infusion in the vein once a month, and all the patients are taking a pill once a day, everyone. And half the patients, the infusion is real frexilizumab and the pill is placebo. And the other half the patients, the pill is Aubagio and the infusion is dummy drug. And they're blinded. They don't know what they're on, and I don't know what they're on. And so that's ongoing. And the way that frexilizumab works, again, it messes with B cells, but it doesn't cause B cell murder. And one of my patients said something really cute, which I'll share with you. Imagine that this fist is a B cell and this fist is a T cell. In order for MS to get kicked off, the B cell and the T cell literally have to touch, right? They physically touch. And the arm that touches is called the CD40 ligand. So this frexilizumab blocks this. It kind of binds it up so that they can't touch. And when I was describing that to a patient, she said, it's like a B cell condom. Because it kind of wraps up the B cells so that it can't touch. And that is exactly kind of what it's doing. So I thought that was really cute. So more to come, but I'm really glad that I got to spend a few minutes with you and talk about clinical trials. Now, before we ask Stuart to join us and open up the lines to answer your questions, if you would like to fight back, if you would like to stick it to the disease, and you want to go above and beyond just treating your MS, you might consider participating in a clinical trial. There's lots of places where you can learn about clinical trials. For example, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a government website that has a list of every MS trial going on in the United States. You could call the local chapter of the National MS Society or reach out to one of the advocacy organizations in your area and ask which trials are going on where. Or you could ask your MS doctor, hey, what MS clinical trials are you involved in? Or what MS clinical trials are you aware of in our city that I could participate in? And so I just want to share, if you're thinking about that, please consider doing so, because it's by efforts like that that we're able to discover new improved therapies to help people impacted by MS. So that'll end my didactic portion of this chit chat. Thank you very much for allowing me to have that conversation with you. And we'll ask our host, Stuart, to jump back online so we can start to answer some questions.
We're back. All right. We got a lot of people online. I'm so glad to see that. And Dr. Boster, thank you for the presentation. It was exactly what I wanted you to do.
Wonderful.
And so one of the first ones that came up, though, is somebody wants to know exactly, you keep saying molecule, but what is a molecule?
So a molecule is just a way of saying an investigational drug that we're studying, something that we think is going to become a medicine for MS. So we call it a molecule. So it could be a pill, it could be a shot, it could be an infusion. It's just a term to mean a study drug which is being tested in MS.
Okay, great. Next thing, another person writes, and what is a protein? Because so often they hear that during these clinical trials, they talk about proteins.
So there's lots of different kinds of drugs. Some drugs are chemical compounds. And earlier today during my discussion, I mentioned the drug Aubagio. So I'll bring up Aubagio again. Aubagio is a pill and it's a chemical. It's made in a laboratory. You swallow it. And that's a type of medicine. There's other types of medicines which are called biologic agents. So they're not chemical, they're actually a protein that's made in a laboratory. And there's a lot of really effective MS medicines. For example, Teruco, all right, which is natalizumab. This is an infused medicine in the vein, and it's not a chemical, it's a protein. It's a biologic molecule. And so this gets into a little bit of the specifics of the pharmacology of the different kinds of MS medicines.
Great, thank you for that. Next, person's asking, is there any research for stem cell therapy for primary progressive multiple sclerosis?
There's a lot of research worldwide going on looking at all kinds of different ways of trying to treat MS, including looking at stem cell transplantation. And there's different kinds of stem cell transplants. And there are research endeavors looking at different populations, including progressive disease state. So there's trials looking at stem cell transplantation for relapsing MS, and there's trials looking at primary progressive MS.
Great, thank you for that. And the next thing is, wow. Next thing is, person's asking, well, little segment here. Let me read that afterwards. Going back to clinical trials, let's go to talk about clinical trials. You were talking about how there's hundreds of these things happening in the United States. Are they like one-sided, East Coast or West Coast or all over? Tell us about the demographics, about the regions, and the diversity that's involved.
This is a very, very important point. So clinical trials occur all over the world. So, for example, the trials that I was mentioning, the BTK trials, for example, that I was just talking about, those were performed on the East Coast, those were performed on the West Coast, those were performed in the North, they were performed in the South, and they were performed outside the United States, in Canada and Mexico, all throughout Europe. They're internationally done, and that's extremely important because it's not like just one area of the world is impacted by MS. Now, I want to talk about diversity and inclusion, which are really, really important. Because if you only study, for example, middle-aged white men, if you only enroll into a clinical trial middle-aged white men, you don't know whether that medicine might work in women. You don't know if that medicine might work in young or older people. You might not know whether that medicine works in Asian Americans or in African Americans or in Hispanics. And so it's really, really important when we do clinical trials that we have a population in the trial which represents the population of people with the condition. And historically, doctors have done a terrible job of that. Early on, when we first started to study MS medicines, I'm very embarrassed to share that there were clinical trials that didn't involve any people that weren't white. They were all pasty white people. And that's a travesty, actually. And I'm very, very proud that nowadays there's a lot of efforts being put forth to help improve inclusivity, to make sure that there are diverse populations. The number one reason I was taught that African Americans, for example, are not involved in clinical trials is doctors don't ask. And so I was trained to ensure that we always ask everyone, independent of what color or what size or what shape they are, to make sure that we can try to include an inclusive population. That's such an important point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. You're welcome. Going to the African American community, there has been lots of talk all the time about the Tuskegee experiments that happened in the early years, and so you know, the African American community of the United States, the Black American community has been fearful of trying anything to do with experiments. Can you talk about this and tell us what is being done to change mindset of that?
So this is a sliver of American history which is horrible and embarrassing, and fortunately has been corrected. In the 1960s, there was an experiment done in the United States studying syphilis, and what was done is reprehensible. Doctors found African American men in the South of the United States with syphilis and didn't tell them they had syphilis. They hid it from them. And they followed them over time to watch how they got worse. And that is a travesty. That is a terrible and awful thing. And two things happened because of that. Number one, generations of African Americans have been appropriately fearful of something like that happening again, as would any rational human. And so that's what you're referencing with this cultural concern. But another thing happened, which is a good thing. And this is the development of something called institutional review boards, or IRBs. You're not allowed to do clinical research in human beings unless it has been approved by an IRB, an institutional review board. And the institutional review board is created to ensure the safety and the protection of the people participating in the trial. And so at the Boster Center for MS, when we are approached by a manufacturer who has a molecule, who has a potential drug, and they say, hey, this is going to be a great clinical trial, and we have to take all that information and we have to submit it to our IRB. It's not my IRB, the IRB that we use, and the IRB reviews it to determine if it's safe for the person. And as the trial goes on, we are required constantly to update the IRB. And that is exclusively to ensure the safety, so a travesty like Tuskegee could never, ever happen ever again.
Sure. Thank you for that. All right. Next, person's asking, do doctors or patients ever get paid to participate in clinical trials?
Yes, that's a great question. When someone comes to my clinic at the Boster Center to be treated, and let's say they're going to take a medicine for their MS. They're going to take Taruco for their MS, or they're going to take a Baggio for their MS. They are supplied that drug, and it's paid for by the insurance company. And the doctor's visit, my visit, is paid for by the insurance company. So Dr. Boster will get insurance money sent to me to pay for my time in the visit, and the insurance company will purchase the drug for the patient. And that's how the care is paid for. When you do a clinical trial, you're not using insurance money. The manufacturer, the sponsor of the trial, is buying the drug for the patient. They're paying the visit. So I'm being paid not by the insurance, but by the manufacturer, by the sponsor. The MRI is not paid by the insurance, it's paid for by the manufacturer. And oftentimes the patient is given a stipend. They're actually paid a small amount of money to pay for their travel and to pay for their time, because they're taking time out of their life. They're taking time out of their work. And so they're being reimbursed to participate. And all of that is done through the sponsor or the manufacturer, as opposed to through, say, an insurance company.
Thank you for that. So adding into that, there are a lot of clinical trials that are taking place that will actually pay for if a person needs a dog sitter or somebody to come in and feed their cat, or to take care of their children while they're gone, if they need to be gone for multiple nights. So
Yep.
I just want to let everybody know about that. And in case you had anything to add to that, please do.
We have patients that travel to see us from other places. So they'll fly in to see us at the Boster Center. And if they choose to do a clinical trial, oftentimes the sponsor will pay for their flights in. They'll pay for them to stay in a hotel if they need to stay in a hotel, so that they can participate in the clinical trial. Again, that's appropriate because this human being is volunteering something precious. They're volunteering their body to figure out if something might work. And so that's how clinical trials are typically run in the United States and abroad.
Thank you. We spoke about the Black American community with the clinical trials. People also want to know about why there aren't more Asian Americans involved in clinical trials or Native American Indians involved in clinical trials. And could you tell us anything about that, please?
What I will share is that in order to participate in a clinical trial, a clinic or a center like mine has to offer the trial, and a person impacted by MS who meets the criteria has to volunteer to participate. And so what I can share with you is the more opportunities to educate, doing exactly what we're doing right now, by you listening and learning about this, the more opportunities we have to get the word out that we need to have more inclusivity. And that means that we need people of all different walks of life to participate in clinical trials. And that's the only way that we can really up our game and to make sure that people of all different populations are included.
Okay, thank you. Next, good question coming. Why can't trials exclude by comorbidity instead of age? Younger people can also have comorbidity, and largest cohort of MS patients are older than 50.
That's a great question, and the answer has a lot to do with math and statistics. So when you're doing a clinical trial and you want to study whether or not a medicine stops MS relapses, let's say, you want to test people that have MS. If they have MS and then they also have, let's say, an infection, you might not find out adequately about the result of the medicine because that person's infection interferes with the clinical trial. Or if somebody has a risk of heart attack and the drug might increase risk of heart attack, then you wouldn't want to enroll a bunch of people that are at risk of heart attack because it would put them at risk, but it would also cloud the interpretation of the trial. So when we do a clinical trial, we need to try to have control of other comorbid factors so that we can narrow down what we're studying so that we can answer the question. Now, in the real world, real human beings have all kinds of stuff going on. And so once a drug is FDA approved, it's on me as an MS doctor to ask, is this drug appropriate for that patient? And I'll give you an example. There are certain drugs that are very effective, but they have risks associated with them. So for example, I'm very fond of a drug called Mavenclad, which is one of the pills for MS. And Mavenclad, like many other MS drugs, can increase the risk of cancer. And so when they studied the clinical trial, if you had a history of cancer, they didn't let you go in the trial, right? But in the real world, people have risks of cancer. And so the doctor and the patient in the real world, after the drug's been approved, has to sort out if that risk is appropriate or not. So I hope that wasn't a really convoluted answer. Suffice to say that when you're doing a research study, it needs to be as pure as possible so that we can answer the question and find out if it really helps with MS. And then we have to apply that in the real world with all the complexities and comorbid conditions. Separately, I like to answer the question about age. Most people impacted by MS develop MS at age 30 on average, okay? And people don't die from MS at age 33. People live, and wonderfully, they live into their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They can have a normal life expectancy. Most of the time in a clinical trial, they look to enroll people between the age of, let's say, 18 to 55 or 60. Why? It's not because they're ageist and they hate testing people that are older than 55 or 60. It's because they're in the trial, they're statistically looking for changes. And the likelihood of having a new event, a new attack or progression is less frequent the older you get. So this is a stats, it's a math thing. So if you enroll 1,000 people who are 30 years of age, you're more likely to see changes than if you enroll 1,000 people who are, say, 65. Now, I don't like that because I take care of patients independent of their age, but mathematically and from a cost standpoint, you would have to double, triple, or quadruple the number of patients in a trial if you had an older population, which probably pisses off people who are listening to us talk, and it's the unfortunate reality of the math. I do want to say, however, something good about this. There's been an increased effort internationally to study progression of disability. And people impacted by MS are at higher risk of progression as they get older. And it stands to reason we're now including older and older age groups into clinical trials as we study progression. So I'm involved in trials at the Boster Center for MS that enroll up to age 60 or 65. And that is a wonderful new change, which I really, really welcome. But it's not because these manufacturers are evil and bad. It's because they're doing a scientific experiment and they need to have the variables as controlled as possible.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. I'm going to ask that nobody else puts any questions down unless it's extremely important, because we do now have a ton of questions. All right. All right. And for those that don't know, my name is Stuart Schlossman. I'm president and founder of MS Views and News. And I too am like you. I'm an MS patient. Okay. So let's go find some more interesting questions. Going back to BTKs, there's a lot of questions about BTKs, and I'm going to start here. Can we get on a BTK after being treated with Ocrevus?
So right now, BTK inhibitors are FDA approved for certain types of cancer. So there are people that have cancer who are prescribed a BTK inhibitor to treat their cancer. Today, there's no BTK inhibitor approved for any form of MS, which is why we're doing the clinical trials. Now, in the clinical trials, in order to get on the trial, you had to be off of a B-cell medicine for at least 6 months to qualify to get into the trial. Why? Because a B-cell depleter would mess with the testing of the drug, right? And so when you're studying a BTK inhibitor, you don't want to enroll someone that has no B cells, because then you wouldn't see an effect. We don't have an FDA approval for a BTK inhibitor. I predict that we will see tolebrutinib FDA approved for secondary progressive MS. And when the manufacturer seeks approval by the FDA, they will work out the package insert, the deal for who can go on and who can't. And they'll work that out with the FDA. And I predict that it will recommend that you're off of a medicine for a period of time before you go onto the BTK inhibitor. But as of today, we don't have that information because it's still in clinical research.
Great, thank you. All right, so for everybody asking about the BTKs, you know what the doctor just said, and everything is pretty much on hold until they have more information, because everything is in clinical trial. And even though tolebrutinib is further along than anything else right now, we still have to wait to hear about this as well. All right? Okay, great. So next, yes, thank you, Carol. Carol saying thanks to both of us for doing these town hall meetings. Great. We'll see you in 2 months again. All right, next one. People want to know if they could still get into the Hercules trial.
No. So the Hercules trial has completed its enrollment. It enrolled all the patients it was going to enroll. It ran all the years it was going to run, and it locked the data. And so the Hercules trial is now over. We have patients at the Boster Center that are in the long-term extension of the Hercules trial. And they are continuing to be treated because they started off, and like I explained earlier, they're continuing in the open label extension. But no one will be able to go onto tolebrutinib until it's FDA approved. There are other clinical trials. And so if you're listening to this and you think, man, I really wished I had had a chance to participate, there are ongoing trials. There's lots of them. And so I'm excited that you're excited to participate, and I want you to seek out a different clinical trial, like the frexilizumab trial, the Frex drug that I was talking about. That is still actively enrolling all throughout the world. And so near where you live, wherever you live, there are investigators studying frexilizumab, and you could seek one out, and you could potentially participate in one of those exciting trials.
Great. You answered the next question. Okay, so the next thing is major depressive disorder. Somebody heard you speaking about this recently, and they'd like to know if you can elaborate once again.
Absolutely. So I have a YouTube channel, and this past Monday, so yesterday, I put out a YouTube video on depression. And so that's a very timely, and I discussed the fact that I have clinical depression, and I've been treated for my clinical depression, and I'm doing great. And so I shared in that YouTube video my 10-step process to treat depression. So if you haven't seen that video, it's available. It's out on my YouTube channel, which is just my name. But to talk about it briefly, treating depression is really important in the setting of MS because people impacted by MS are twice as likely compared to the general population to experience depression. And depression speeds up MS disease. It makes MS get worse faster, and it colors everything ugly. It's a terrible, terrible thing. And so treating depression is really, really important. And we don't treat depression with 1, 2, or 3 things. It's a multi-pronged approach. As I shared in that video, there's at least 10 things that I think are critically important when treating depression. And so I'll go through a couple of them right now, but if you'd like to have a deep dive, then check out that video. So one of the things we want to do when treating depression is we want to make sure you're getting adequate sleep. And before you roll your eyes and say, your mom was right, getting proper sleep is a way to treat mood disorder. Number 2, paying attention to what you eat. So eating ultra-processed foods and crap can really increase the risk of depression. And cleaning up your diet, believe it or not, can increase your ability to thwart depression. Avoiding excessive amounts of drugs and alcohol can improve depression. Participating in activities, physical activities, exercising as part of your lifestyle has been shown time and time again to help treat depression. Participating in talk therapy, listening, working with a trained listener has been shown time and time again to help with depression. Taking an antidepressant medicine are all things that we can do. In my experience, working with thousands of people impacted by MS over the last 20 years, it's very rare that we knock depression out of the park with just one maneuver. It typically takes multiple maneuvers. And so if you feel sad, blue, and depressed, I don't want you to live that way. I want you to go to your neurologist and say, hey, I'm feeling sad and blue, and I want you to help me get treated for your depression, because depression is completely treatable. That was a great question. Thank you for asking it.
Great. Awesome, Kevin. Thank you for usual putting in your good 2 cents worth. All right. A person is now asking also, does trauma, verbal abuse from childhood, could that be a cause, a stressor like for a person to get MS?
So this has been studied, and it doesn't appear that childhood psychological trauma can cause MS. Stress doesn't make anything better at all. Nobody goes home at night and says, honey, let's get really stressed out. That's not a conversation that people have. And whereas I don't think stress can cause MS, stress absolutely can make anything worse. And childhood trauma can make anything worse. Childhood trauma can increase risk of depression, for example. And addressing childhood trauma, working with a therapist, is a really, really important thing to do. And it's something that with time and therapy, you can actually move past, which is a really beautiful thing.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware about a PIPE 307 study on green mamba venom as a trial by University of California, San Francisco for multiple sclerosis? Are you aware anything about this?
I am. So there's a molecule, there's a potential drug called PIPE 307, which has been studied as a possible remyelinating agent. And so that's gotten a lot of popular press. It's become very excited to be talked about on social media. And so I also have a lot of colleagues that have made some really great YouTube videos about it. So Dr. Brandon Bieber is a buddy of mine who also is in California. Dr. Bieber has a YouTube channel. He has a wonderful video out on PIPE 307. And so there's now active clinical trials studying it in the setting of multiple sclerosis in hopes that it will be a remyelinating agent. And so I won't talk more about it. That's one of those areas of ongoing research that's very exciting. But that's something that you might want to look up. And if you're in the California area where they're doing the trial, you might look and see if that's something you could participate in.
Great. Thank you so much. Next question. Why has Ampera not had further trials since it helps with more than walking?
That's a great question. So Ampera, 4-aminopyridine, is a medicine that's been approved for MS. It's not a disease-modifying therapy. It doesn't slow down multiple sclerosis. When you respond to Ampyra, what it does is it helps with motor fatigue and heat sensitivity. Some people impacted by MS, when they get overheated, they kind of melt. Their old neurological symptoms get much, much worse. And for example, their legs will get weak, or for example, they lose vision in their eye, or for example, the burning in their arm gets worse. And when people respond to Ampyra, they're buttressed against that. I was involved in the Accorda clinical trials that led to the FDA approval of Ampyra. And when we studied Ampyra, we studied it based on walking speed. Why? Because it's easy to study walking speed. We literally would have people walk 25 feet, and then we put them on Ampyra, and then we'd see if they could walk 25 feet faster. And it worked. And so it was FDA approved. As the person who asked the question points out, Ampyra does a lot of other stuff, but it's a lot harder to test those other things. Another thing which is really important is doing MS clinical trials is insanely expensive. So you might be shocked to learn that when you do a trial, it's about $100 million per arm of trial per year. So if you do a 3-year trial testing drug A versus drug B, that's $600 million that are going to be spent, which is cost prohibitive for a lot of things. And so it would be awesome if money grew on trees that we could go back and test these things. But instead, what we end up having to do is we have a drug, Ampyra, that's FDA approved, and it's been FDA approved for walking speed. None of my patients want to walk faster. They want to walk longer. They want to be able to garden outside when it's hot outside, and they don't want to have heat sensitive symptoms, which really destroy their quality of life. And so we find all kinds of uses for a medicine like Ampyra. I'll share a quick story with you. It's one of my favorites as it relates to Ampyra. A dear patient of mine and his wife were in clinic, and I had put him on Ampyra, and this was a visit to follow up. But I had forgotten to ask about Ampyra, so I had started it, and shame on me. We're having our visit. We're doing lots of stuff. And right as we were wrapping up the visit, the wife says, "You forgot to ask about how he's doing on Ampyra." I said, "Oh, my goodness gracious, how's he doing?" And she says, "You may never, ever remove his Ampyra." I said, "Okay." She said, "I don't think you understand. You may never remove his Ampyra." And I said, "Is he walking better?" She says, "No. When he got MS at age 18, he developed erectile dysfunction. When his body would get overheated, his erection was not present, and it made it really, really hard to have intercourse, which is terrible because you get excited, you get hot, and then it didn't work. On Ampyra, he was 18 again. And so the Ampyra in this gentleman treated heat-related erectile dysfunction. And so it was a really kind of awesome thing. And that's an off-label example of how a medicine like Ampyra can do more than just help with walking.
Great, thank you for that. All right, next. By the way, how does a person have an erection without an erection unless there's an erection? Okay.
That's like a tongue twister.
Sure. All right, next. Person's asking, why is Aubagio used as a comparable medication if it only reduces relapses by 31%?
There's a reason. Because it's very easy to blind to Aubagio. Let me explain. Aubagio is a pill taken once a day. And Aubagio has, all things considered, a very safe and easy side effect profile. When you're doing a clinical trial, like I was describing earlier, where you're on drug A or drug B, you can give someone Aubagio and you can hide it so they don't know if it's real Aubagio or fake Aubagio. It's easy to use Aubagio in a clinical trial. It's not because it's really good or really bad or because it has a 30% reduction. It's because it's easy to incorporate Aubagio into a clinical trial design.
Okay, thank you. Next, could someone with MS donate blood to a plasma bank?
Yes. So just because you have MS doesn't mean you're disallowed to donate blood. However, you have to consider which medicines you're receiving. So if you're receiving, for example, chemo, all right, and so you have chemotherapy floating through your blood, you need to tell the blood bank what you're on because they might not want you to donate blood because of the special medicine that you're receiving. But ostensibly, you can donate blood if you have MS, and I have many patients that do.
Great, thank you. By the way, the Red Cross doesn't take my blood.
Yeah.
They say they don't know where I got it from, so they don't want to take it. Okay. Has methylene blue been proved to help MS?
No.
Okay. Next one. This is outside of clinical trials, but I need to know diversity. Is there any connection with sickle cell trait and MS?
No. Sometimes nature's too generous. And so I have patients that have multiple sclerosis. They also have sickle cell anemia or sickle cell trait. Sometimes nature's a little too generous and you can have more than one bad thing.
Correct. All right. Next one is a woman diagnosed with MS in MS Can Do Zoom class said that she lies on a healthy wave mat and it helps her feet with less fatigue. She takes naps on the mat and reads books on it. She said her dog also liked them lying on the mat too. Does any of this, have you heard anything about this and any research on it?
I have not, which doesn't mean it doesn't work and it doesn't mean that there isn't research. I'm just not familiar with that. So thank you for sharing that, and it's something I'll read up on.
What do you know about the vibrating plates for gosh, I forgot specifically, but I think it was used for just balance.
So I have several patients over the years who have found benefits to various vibrating plates. I have one patient in particular that I recall. He had really bad MS constipation, and many people with MS have constipation, and he would sit on a vibrating plate and it would actually help him get his bowels moving. Also, many of you, I'm going to date myself, but you remember the Wii Fit, those balance boards, which was like a Nintendo apparatus. And there's actually studies done showing that using a Wii Fit balance board can help with balance in MS. And so there's been clinical trials that have actually looked at that, and they found that it was very helpful. And I've actually recommended to patients before that they may go buy an old Wii Fit and use the games to help retrain their balance. Also, if you've never used a Wii Fit, it's pretty fun.
Awesome. I need you to give a really long answer on vestibular therapy. Tell us about it, and I'll be right back. Okay, thank you.
So when someone is trying to live their best life despite having MS, we want to do several things. God forbid they have an attack, we want to give them medicine to hasten their recovery, right? We want to put them on a disease-modifying therapy to slow their multiple sclerosis, to prevent future attacks, to prevent new brain damage on MRI, to slow disability progression. But in addition to those two things, we also want to treat symptoms. Symptoms are things that stink. And unfortunately, many people impacted by MS can accrue various symptoms. One of arguably the most yucky symptoms that a patient may experience is problems with balance. The brain has a bunch of intricate systems which are like gyroscopes that keep you upright and balanced. And when you have damage to the brain or spinal cord from MS, it can mess with those balance centers. And so there's all kinds of different balance-related problems that people impacted by MS can experience. One of them is called vertigo. In vertigo, the neurological definition of vertigo is when someone has a hallucination of spinning, or they feel like the room is spinning. And another very common unpleasant experience that people can have in MS is something called ataxia, which is like what happens when you get drunk and you stumble about, or if you're on a boat and you don't have your sea legs. And both vertigo and ataxia are terrible experiences, and they can lead to people falling, smacking their head. It's a real bad thing. One of the best ways that we treat things like vertigo and things like ataxia, there's no pill for those things. We use what's called vestibular physical therapy. So let me explain this very briefly. Physical therapists are amazing men and women that go to school to help people rehabilitate from deficits, all kinds of different stuff, from a stroke to a busted knee. Some physical therapists go on to do specialized training and they become what's called a neurophysical therapist. And so Stuart and I are friends with an amazing gal, Dr. Gretchen Howley. She's a neurophysical therapist, right? So she's done extra schooling to understand neurological conditions like strokes and like Parkinson's and MS. And there's neurophysical therapists that further specialize in vestibular physical therapy, and they are masters of walking and they're masters of dizzy. And they can help patients retrain their brains to overcome ataxia and vertigo and spinning. And so if you have one of those problems, don't accept that. Get ye to the neurophysical therapist, get ye to the vestibular physical therapist where they can help retrain your gait. I'll give you a quick example of a dear patient of mine. She's absolutely wonderful. And she had a terrible experience. She's very religious and she liked to go to church very often, but her church and her community, the floor of the church made her have terrible vertigo. And she couldn't go into the church because of how bad the vertigo was, which is horrible for her. She worked with a vestibular physical therapist for a very long time, for months and months. And they not only helped her learn to rewalk in the vestibular lab, in the PT, they actually went to the church in the evening and they trained her walking on that crazy carpet. And she can now go to church and enjoy her ability to participate with her religious community. And that's because of the benefits of vestibular PT.
Great, thank you for that. Please know, everybody, for those that ask questions after I asked you not to ask questions, unfortunately, we're not going to get to your questions, but we will get to them the next time that we're on in 2 months. So if you come back at that time, you could ask the question again, or you could find Dr. Boster on his channel on Saturday mornings and ask him there as well. Going forward with what you were just talking about with vestibular therapy and the such of imbalance and et cetera, a person with ataxia or a person that has seizures or vestibular problems, can they be included in clinical trials or will they automatically be excluded?
They would not automatically be excluded. Now, the person asking the question asked about several different things: vertigo, ataxia, and seizures, which are 3 separate things. If a patient with MS has seizures, and people impacted by MS are 6 times more likely to have seizures compared to the general population, they're not typically excluded from the trial unless the seizures are uncontrolled. The vast majority of seizures are well controlled on a seizure medicine. So if you have MS and you happen to have seizures, and you're able to control your seizures on a medicine, very often it's not a problem in participation. Likewise, if you have MS and you happen to have ataxia or you happen to have vertigo, it does not exclude you from participation in the clinical trial. And so that wouldn't be a reason to say, you can't participate.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Person writes that he or she had been given the name of a frexilizumab trial because he or she has SPMS and is progressing actively, but his or her neurologist said that they would not be allowed to participate as they had been previously on Mavenclad from 2020 to 2022. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes. So again, when you're doing a clinical trial, you're studying a medicine. Remember earlier I said a molecule. You're studying a research medicine. And the goal is to find out, how does that research medicine work in someone treated with MS? Mavenclad and other drugs like Lemtrada or other drugs like mitoxantrone work by changing the behavior of the immune system for a very, very long time. So when you take Mavenclad, it changes the way your cells behave for years and years and years. And so if you put someone on Mavenclad and then a year later put them in a clinical trial, you wouldn't be able to interpret the results. Now, does that mean that that drug's never going to be used after someone's had Mavenclad? Not at all. But in the clinical trial, in the research trial, so that we can sort out left from right, they will exclude someone that's been on immune reconstitution therapy because it would cloud the ability to interpret the trial.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have question is, with all the cuts in healthcare and the FDA, et cetera, is this going to affect your great work?
I hope not. I am pretty darn motivated to help families impacted by MS make this disease boring, and for people impacted by MS to live their best life despite having the condition. And I hope sincerely that all of the crazy changes that we're dealing with right now will not impact my ability to do that. Thus far, it has not. I'm not planning to change my clinical practice in my offerings. I'm not planning on changing our offerings of clinical trials. I'm not planning on changing our YouTube offerings. And so there's no end in sight for what we plan to do.
Thank you very much. Next one, going back to clinical trials, are there any trials for pediatrics under the age of 18 with MS?
Yes, there's a lot of trials studying children impacted by MS. So I'm involved in a trial right now, which is called Operetta. And in the Operetta trial, we enroll patients 16, 17, 18, so teenagers. And we're looking at two drugs, Gilenya and Ocrevus. So Gilenya is actually FDA approved for children with MS. Well, there's a trial done years ago, and it was found to be safe and effective. And in the clinical trial, all the children with MS are taking a pill once a day, and they're getting an infusion in the vein twice a year. And half of the children, the infusion is real and the pill is fake. And the other half of the children, the pill is real and the infusion is fake. So it's, I don't know if I just said that backwards, but half the people are on real infusion, fake pill. Half the people are on fake pill, real pill, fake infusion. I guess I'm getting tired. My point here is it's a blinded clinical trial where every kid is on a real drug. We just don't know which one. And that trial is called the Operetta trial. And it's very exciting because we want to try to figure out if giving a child, an adolescent, Ocrevus would be an effective way of treating their MS. And so there's a lot of clinical trials like that. If you know a young person impacted by MS, you might ask them if they're interested in a clinical trial. And you can go, for example, to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a government-sponsored website, and you can see every clinical trial that's available in the United States for MS, including a host of them for children with MS.
Sure, thank you. And if anybody wants to know more about that, you could go to the MS Views and News website. We have a fabulous resource section that tells you how to get onto clinicaltrials.gov, as well as a zillion other things, that everything that you need to know about multiple sclerosis and don't know where to find it, you can find it there, okay? All right, two questions I'm going to combine because we're running out of time. Studies on restoration of the myelin sheath and regenerative medicine.
So this is a very, very hot topic. The idea here is that in order to fix MS, to hypothetically cure MS, we need to do more than just decrease inflammation. So many of the 28 drugs that are currently available, they work by various ways to decrease inflammation, which is an effective and important thing, but it's not by itself going to cure the condition. In addition to what I call as an anti-inflammatory, we also need something to protect the brain, a neuroprotective agent, and we also need a remyelinating agent. And so there are ongoing clinical trials studying both remyelination. For example, that question earlier about the PIPE trial is looking at a potential remyelinating agent, and there are studies looking at neuroprotection. So these are ongoing. And if you're interested and excited about clinical trial participation, you can go to the MS Views and News website, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and you can seek out which trials are involved looking at remyelination, which trials are involved in neuroprotection, and you might seek out participation in one of those trials, which would be really cool.
Great, thank you for that. Next, if a patient develops severe lymphoma since taking a B-cell sequester, DMT, should this type of DMT be discontinued or perhaps a case be made for IG shots to help reduce the rate of infection?
I don't have enough information to comment about that specific situation. I think what the person is asking about is when you take a B-cell medicine, there's a risk that it would lower your antibody levels. And when that happens, there's an increased risk of infection. And so there's a couple different maneuvers to try to treat that. One is to stop the medicine. Two is to space out the medicine. Three is to add IVIG. But I don't have enough information to answer for that specific human being. And of course, they need to talk to their doctor about what's going to be the right answer for them.
Great, thank you. And before we shut down, because we're not shutting down yet, we still got another 4 or 5 minutes, but a few people have said that they've watched these things for the last few months that we've been doing these town hall meetings, and that today's program is by far the best. Yet I think the same person said the same thing the last time. So
Well,
we're only
thank
getting
you.
better then.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, lots of hearts going in here as well. Are immunosuppressive MS drugs better at controlling progression than non-immunosuppressive drugs like Copaxone?
Yes.
That's a good answer. Okay, next one. SPMS is a continuation of RM. Is SPMS a continuation of RRMS? And where does PPMS
Yes.
fit in?
So yes, secondary progressive MS is just part of a continuum. So when someone has a relapsing form of MS, they're at risk of relapses. They're also at risk of progression. And when they are chronologically younger, there's a higher risk of attacks and a lower risk of progression considering the two. That same human being, as they get a bit older, their likelihood of having an attack goes down some and the likelihood of progression goes up some. And we neurology nerds try to divide things up, and we say, okay, well, we're going to call this phase of things relapsing MS, and we're going to call this phase of things secondary progressive MS, but it's really a continuum. Primary progressive MS, from a phenotypic standpoint, from a description standpoint, is a bit different in that the person starts off their disease not having attacks. They don't have attacks. They just slowly get worse over time. And so they primarily progress, hence the name.
So that being said, what is secondary SPMS without relapse?
That's a description of a human being with MS who used to have attacks, but has not had an attack in some time, at least 5 years, who is getting worse independent from attack. And that description is secondary progressive MS because they primarily had attacks and now secondarily they're progressing without relapses. So it's describing someone's state of affairs in the setting of having MS.
Okay. All right. And we are going to call it a wrap. Okay. Dr. Boster, thank you again. I'll speak to you soon. As always,
thank you guys. Be wonderful. Have a great night. And Stuart, thank you for having me. Take care. I'll see you soon. Bye.
Also, thanks. Good night.